The night was cold and damp in New York, with shop window lights flickering like small beacons of hope for the few who still wandered the streets. Oliver, an elderly man with a frail appearance, dragged his tired feet along the pothole-ridden sidewalks. His eyes, mirrors of sadness and resignation, reflected years of suffering and loneliness. The biting wind made his bones ache, and hunger tormented him like a shadow he couldn't shake off. He stopped in front of a small bakery, where the smell of fresh bread was a cruel invitation to his empty stomach. With trembling hands and a heart full of despair, Oliver pushed the door open, making a small bell ring that echoed in his chest like a warning. The baker, a burly man with a stern look, raised his head upon seeing him enter. "Can I help you?" asked the baker, his voice dripping with disdain at the sight of Oliver's dirty clothes and wrinkled face. "Please, sir, a piece of bread," Oliver pleaded, his voice weak and imploring. Each word seemed a monumental effort, each syllable carrying the humiliation of years lived on the fringes of society. The baker frowned, an expression of disgust crossing his face. Without a word, he moved quickly, grabbing Oliver by the arm and pushing him out of the store. Oliver stumbled, falling heavily onto the cold, hard sidewalk. The physical pain was nothing compared to the blow to his already battered dignity. As he struggled to get up, his wrinkled, dirty hands trying to find support on the rough concrete, a female voice cut through the air. "Stop that! How can you treat someone like this?" The young woman who spoke had eyes full of fury and determination. Maggie, a figure of compassion and justice, couldn't stay indifferent to the cruelty she had just witnessed. She ran to Oliver, kneeling beside him. Their eyes met, and in that moment, a deep, silent connection was formed. Maggie felt a tightness in her chest, a mix of sadness and anger for seeing a human being treated so inhumanely. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft and full of concern. Oliver only nodded, words stuck in his throat, choked by emotion. She stood up, facing the baker with an expression that could pierce steel. "How could you? He only wanted a piece of bread." Her voice trembled with indignation. The baker, ashamed, stepped back, mumbling apologies that sounded empty and meaningless. Maggie helped Oliver to his feet, her touch gentle but firm. "Come with me, I'll help you." Her words were like a bomb, a ray of light in the darkness enveloping Oliver's life. She took him to a small cafe across the street. There, she ordered a hot meal for him, and while they waited, they began to talk. Oliver, still suspicious and hesitant, slowly started to open up. He told her fragments of his life, stories of better times, and how everything fell apart due to events he could barely recall without pain flooding his mind. Maggie listened to every word attentively, feeling each piece of pain and suffering he shared. The sadness in Oliver's eyes, mixed with a silent dignity, touched something deep inside her. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she was determined to do everything possible to help Oliver find some peace in the present. However, neither of them could imagine that this encounter was not just a momentary act of kindness, but the beginning of a journey that would uncover long-buried secrets and reveal family ties they both were unaware of. The meal arrived, and Oliver, with tears in his eyes, thanked Maggie. He held her hand tightly, feeling for the first time in a long time that someone truly cared about him. In the small cafe where Maggie and Oliver sat, the environment was cozy, but the atmosphere was heavy with the tension of their untold stories. Oliver, with his hands still trembling, looked at the hot meal in front of him. It was a simple dish of soup with bread, but to him, it represented much more: dignity and humanity restored, if only for a brief moment. Maggie watched his every move, her heart tight with a mix of sadness and compassion. She wondered how many times he had been treated with indifference, how many doors had been slammed in his face. Sitting there, she felt an unexpected responsibility grow within her. "Do you have anyone? Family?" she asked softly, trying not to invade his personal space too much. Oliver hesitated, his eyes fixed on the steaming soup. He picked up the bread carefully, as if fearing any sudden movement might break the fragile moment of kindness he was experiencing. "No, not anymore," he finally replied. The hoarse voice, filled with years of helplessness, made Maggie feel a lump in her throat. She realized she was treading on delicate ground. She decided to change tactics, focusing on something lighter. "How did you end up here, Oliver? What's your story?" He sighed deeply, the weight of years of misery evident in every wrinkle on his face. "Oh dear, it's a long story. I had a life before this, a good life. I had a family, a job." He paused, swallowing hard. "But then, things changed. One day, I lost everything." Maggie nodded, encouraging him to continue. She wanted to understand what had happened, what had turned this man into a shadow of who he once was. It was a misunderstanding, a betrayal, actually, he continued, his voice trembling with anger and sadness. "A relative, someone I trusted, made everyone believe I was guilty of something terrible. I was cast aside, forgotten. I lost everything, my home, my family, my dignity." The sincerity in his voice and the suffering that came through every word brought tears to Maggie's eyes. She couldn't imagine the pain of being betrayed by someone loved, being thrown to the margins of society without a way to defend oneself. "I'm so sorry, Oliver," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "No one deserves to go through that." Oliver looked at her, his eyes reflecting a silent gratitude. "You are the first person in years who cares." He held her hand again, and Maggie felt the connection between them strengthen. As they talked, Maggie's mind raced. There was something in his story that seemed vaguely familiar. She remembered stories her grandmother told about a relative who disappeared many years ago, a story shrouded in mystery and pain. But she never imagined she could find answers in a cafe in downtown New York, holding the hand of a man whose life had been destroyed by a lie. The conversation continued, each revelation bringing more pain, but also more determination in Maggie. She knew she needed to help Oliver find peace. But first, she needed to fully understand his story, to know who had betrayed him and why. Oliver, in turn, began to feel lighter, as if sharing his story was lifting a weight off his shoulders. He looked at Maggie and saw in her a light, a hope he thought was lost forever. The clock in the cafe marked the passing time, but for them, it seemed the world had stopped. There, in that small refuge, two wounded souls found each other, and together they began to rebuild the broken pieces of their lives. In the following days, Maggie couldn't get Oliver out of her mind. His story, his pain, and silent dignity had embedded themselves in her heart like a seed that needed to grow. She found herself rummaging through her grandmother's old papers, dusty documents, and faded photos, searching for something that could link Oliver's past to hers. Nights were sleepless, with Maggie being haunted by fragments of memory and the image of Oliver's tired face. One afternoon, while flipping through an old family album, her eyes stopped on a specific photo. It was of a young man, with eyes that seemed to mirror Oliver's. Maggie felt her heart race. Could it be him? Her mind buzzed with possibilities and doubts. Desperate for answers, she decided to confront her mother, Sarah, who always avoided talking about the story of the disappeared relative. Sarah was sitting in the living room, sewing, when Maggie rushed in, holding the photo. "Mom, I need you to look at this," said Maggie, her voice trembling. "Do you know this man?" Sarah raised her eyes, and upon seeing the photo, her expression changed from confusion to deep sorrow. She put the sewing aside and took the photo with trembling hands. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "In Grandma's albums. Mom, I met a man, a homeless man. He said he was betrayed by a relative, that he lost everything. I think he's my grandfather." Sarah looked at Maggie. Eyes full of tears she tried to hold back. "Maggie, this is an old and painful story." She took a deep breath, as if gathering strength to continue. "Your grandfather, Jonathan, was accused of theft by his own brother, my Uncle Richard. No one believed him, and he was cast out of the family. We never saw him again." Maggie felt a tightness in her chest. "Mom, his name isn't Jonathan. He goes by Oliver. He's alive and he's suffering so much. We need to do something." Sarah bowed her head, tears falling into her lap. "I never knew what really happened. Richard was always ambitious, always wanting more." She looked at Maggie with newfound determination. We need to find the truth. We need to bring justice." The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and discoveries. Maggie and Sarah joined forces to investigate the past, each unearthed document bringing more clarity and pain. They discovered old letters, hidden by Richard, that proved Jonathan's innocence. The letters were irrefutable evidence that Richard had framed Jonathan. Maggie couldn't believe the extent of the betrayal. She felt betrayed by her own family, and her anger only grew. But along with the anger came a fierce determination. She needed to find Oliver and tell him the truth. When she finally found him again, he was at the same cafe where they had first talked. Maggie ran to him, her heart beating wildly. Oliver looked at her in surprise, his tired eyes trying to understand the urgency on her face. "Oliver, I discovered everything." She held his hands, her eyes shining with tears. "You are Jonathan, my grandfather. Richard betrayed you. He made everyone believe you were guilty, but I found the proof. We can clear your name." Oliver looked at her, the words not making sense immediately. Then, slowly, understanding dawned. His eyes filled with tears, and he squeezed Maggie's hand tightly. I didn't know what to do for so many years. I thought everyone hated me, that I could never return." His voice was choked with emotion. "But you believed in me." Maggie hugged him tightly, feeling the weight of decades of pain and suffering dissolve a little in that embrace. As Maggie hugged Oliver, the weight of the revelation still echoed in their minds. The intensity of the moment had left them both emotionally exhausted, but it had also ignited a flame of determination. Maggie knew their journey was just beginning, and that the justice they sought would require courage and resilience. That night, Maggie took Oliver to her home, where he could finally find a safe place to rest. When they arrived, Sarah welcomed them with tears in her eyes and open arms. It was a moment of tenderness and healing, but also the beginning of a battle for redemption and justice. In the days that followed, Maggie and Sarah dedicated themselves to gathering all the evidence they had found. Richard's letters incriminating Jonathan were crucial pieces, but they knew they needed more to bring down the lies and restore the truth. With each document discovered, each new lead unearthed, Maggie felt Oliver's past pain as if it were her own. Sarah contacted old friends and relatives, trying to recover memories and testimonies that could corroborate Jonathan's innocence. The task was not easy. Many didn't want to get involved, fearing the repercussions of uncovering long-buried secrets. Others, however, were supportive, remembering the kind man Jonathan was before he was betrayed. During this time, Oliver began to share more details about his life with Maggie. The nights were filled with stories of a happy childhood, a loving marriage, and a life that seemed perfect until it was destroyed by Richard's greed. Maggie listened attentively, feeling each word like a stab in her heart. She desperately wanted to restore Oliver's dignity, but she knew the road would be long and full of obstacles. One night, while reviewing the documents in Sarah's basement, Maggie found an old diary. The pages were yellowed with time, but the writing was clear. It was her grandmother's diary, detailing the events that led to Jonathan's betrayal. Maggie read aloud, her voice trembling with emotion. "Jonathan was so happy that day, finally closing the deal that would secure our family's future. But Richard was jealous. I saw the greed in his eyes. I can't believe he would do this to his own brother." Each word was a new blow of pain for Oliver, but also a validation of everything he had always known to be true. He closed his eyes, letting the tears flow freely, feeling Maggie's silent support beside him. "We will use this," said Maggie with determination, holding the diary tightly. "We will expose Richard and clear your name, Grandpa. We won't let him get away with it." However, the path would not be simple. Richard, upon learning that Maggie and Sarah were getting closer to the truth, began making moves to protect his lies. He tried to intimidate old acquaintances, buying their silence and destroying any evidence that might surface. The fight intensified, and Maggie felt the pressure mounting. In a tense confrontation with Richard, Maggie couldn't hide her disgust. "How could you?" she challenged, staring at the man who had destroyed her grandfather's life. "How could you condemn your own brother to a life on the streets?" Richard, with a cold smile, tried to deflect. "You don't understand, girl. Business is business. Jonathan wasn't prepared for what was coming. I did what was necessary. What you did was destroy a family, Maggie replied, her voice firm despite the anger boiling inside her. But it ends now. We will expose you for what you really are. The confrontation with Richard left Maggie more determined than ever. She knew the battle would be difficult, but she was willing to fight to the end to bring justice to Oliver. Each discovery, each piece of evidence, was a step closer to repairing the past and finally finding peace. The battle against Richard was far from easy, and each day brought new challenges. Maggie, Sarah, and Oliver found themselves more united than ever, but also more exhausted and emotionally drained. Richard's shadow seemed to hover over every move they made. Each step toward the truth met with resistance and threats. One night, while Maggie and Oliver were reviewing the documents again, there was a sound of breaking glass in the next room. They rushed to see what had happened and found a stone with a threatening message tied to it. Stop or you'll regret it. Oliver felt his heart tighten. Maggie, we can't continue with this if it puts you and your mother in danger. No, Grandpa, said Maggie, holding his hand firmly. We won't give up. He wants to intimidate us, but we won't back down. We'll fight for you. Maggie's determination was unwavering, but the threat was real and present. They knew Richard would do anything to protect his lies, and with each step they took, the pressure increased. One morning, while Oliver was in the garden trying to find a moment of peace, Maggie received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was cold and calculating. Maggie, you'd better stop now. You don't know who you're dealing with. Who are you? She asked, though she knew the answer. Someone who can make your life a living hell, the voice said before abruptly hanging up. Maggie felt a shiver run down her spine, but her fear quickly turned to anger. She knew she couldn't let Richard win. They needed more proof, something irrefutable that could expose him completely. Sarah had an idea. Maggie, what if we look for former employees of your grandfather's company? Maybe someone knows something that can help us. The idea was good, and they began tracking down people who had worked with Jonathan. Many doors were closed, but eventually, they found a former secretary named Eleanor who was willing to talk. Eleanor was an elderly woman, but still very lucid. She welcomed them into her home and began telling everything she knew. Jonathan was a good man. He worked hard and always treated everyone with respect. But Richard, he was always too ambitious. She paused, seeming to get lost in painful memories. I remember overhearing conversations. Richard scheming, manipulating. Once, he mentioned something about forging documents to incriminate Jonathan. I didn't say anything at the time. I was afraid. Oliver felt a tightness in his chest upon hearing these words. Eleanor, do you still have any of those documents? Eleanor nodded, standing up slowly and going to a safe. She returned with an envelope full of papers yellowed with time. I kept this, in case the truth ever needed to be revealed. Maggie took the envelope with trembling hands. As she flipped through it, she found the documents proving Richard's forgery, as well as letters showing his intentions to destroy Jonathan. This is enough, she said, tears streaming down her face. We can finally expose him. The trip back home was filled with tense silence, each lost in their thoughts. They knew the battle was far from over, but now they had a powerful weapon against Richard. When they arrived home, they were greeted by Sarah, who was anxious for news. Maggie handed her the documents, and together, they began planning their next steps. But as they were going through the papers, a car abruptly stopped in front of the house. Richard got out, his face contorted with anger. You think you can take me down? He shouted, advancing towards the door. You have no idea what you're up against. Richard advanced with long, threatening steps toward the house, his eyes blazing with fury. Maggie, Oliver, and Sarah felt their hearts race as he approached. Maggie, trying to stay calm, positioned herself between Richard and the door. You have no right to be here. Richard, she said, her voice firm despite the fear coursing through her veins. We know what you did. We have proof. Richard laughed, a bitter, joyless sound. Proof? You think a few pieces of paper will change anything? You have no idea how the world really works. I've controlled this family for years, and I'm not going to let a brat like you ruin everything. You don't understand, Maggie replied, her eyes full of determination. "We will expose you. No matter what it takes, we won't stop until the truth comes out." Sarah, with tears in her eyes, joined Maggie. "You destroyed our father, Richard. You stole our lives, our family. No more lies." Richard looked at the two women with contempt, but before he could respond, Oliver, with slow, painful steps, approached. "Richard," he began, his voice tired but resolute, "you took everything from me. My family, my dignity, but you couldn't take my truth. I survived, even when you tried to destroy me." Richard took a step back, surprised by the unexpected strength in Oliver's voice. "You should have stayed on the streets, old man. There's no place for you here." Maggie, holding the documents in her hands, took a step forward. "These papers prove everything. Your forgeries, your lies. We're taking this to justice." Richard, realizing his words were having no effect, resorted to threats. "If you don't stop, I'll destroy each one of you. You mean nothing to me." The tension in the room was palpable. Maggie knew they were at a critical moment. They couldn't back down now, not when they were so close to finally achieving justice. Suddenly, Sarah, with a strength Maggie had never seen, grabbed Richard by the arm. "We're not afraid of you. We're going to fight for Jonathan. We're going to fight for the truth." Richard pulled his arm away, irritated, but was interrupted by the sound of sirens in the distance. Maggie had called the police, anticipating the need for protection. The growing sound of sirens brought a tense relief to the room. When the police arrived, Maggie quickly explained the situation, handing them the documents that incriminated Richard. The officers, after a brief assessment, decided to take Richard in for questioning, at least until they could verify the evidence. As he was being led away, Richard cast a final hateful look at the family. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I'll be back." Maggie, Oliver, and Sarah stood at the door, watching as Richard was taken away. The sense of relief was immediate, but mixed with anxiety about what lay ahead. They knew the battle was far from over, but at least for now, they had a moment of peace. Oliver, with tears in his eyes, turned to Maggie and Sarah. "You are my strength. I could never have done this without you." Maggie hugged him, feeling the tension leave her body. "We're in this together, Grandpa. We'll fight to the end." Sarah joined the embrace, the feeling of unity stronger than ever. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and dangers, but they also knew that together they could face anything. With Richard out of the picture, at least temporarily, they prepared for the next phase of the fight. They needed legal support, allies who could help ensure the truth was finally heard. And most importantly, they needed courage to face what was yet to come. As night fell, the house was filled with a heavy silence, but also a renewed hope. The first step had been taken, and with each new day, they were closer to the justice they so desperately sought. In the quiet of the night, after the afternoon turmoil, Maggie, Sarah, and Oliver gathered in the living room. The tension in the air was palpable, but there was also an underlying current of relief and determination. The sound of the sirens had already faded, but Richard's promise still echoed in their minds. "This isn't over." Sarah brought tea for everyone, her hands trembling slightly as she served the cups. "We need a plan," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Richard won't give up easily." Oliver looked at Maggie with eyes full of gratitude and sadness. "I'm so sorry, Maggie. I never wanted you and your mother to go through this." Maggie squeezed his hand, love and determination in her eyes. "We're in this together, Grandpa. We're going to face Richard and clear your name, no matter what happens." With the documents in hand, they knew they needed legal support. Maggie contacted a family friend who was a lawyer, James, a man of principles who had always fought for justice. The next morning, they met in James's office, where they told him the whole story and handed over the evidence. James examined the documents carefully, his expression becoming more serious with each passing moment. "This is more than enough to start a case against Richard," he said finally. "But you need to be prepared. He'll fight with everything he has." Back at home, the anxiety grew. Every phone ring, every knock on the door, made their hearts race. They were on the brink of a legal and emotional war that would test every fragment of their courage. One night, while Maggie was reviewing the documents once more, Her phone rang. It was an anonymous call. Hesitant, she answered. "Maggie?" The voice on the other end was familiar, but filled with pain. "It's me, Richard. We need to talk." Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. "We have nothing to say to each other, Richard. Please, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I've made many mistakes, but we need to resolve this. Meet me tomorrow in the park at 10 in the morning." Maggie hung up, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Sarah and Oliver noticed the change in her expression and pressed her to know what had happened. When she told them about the call, their concern grew. "It could be a trap," said Sarah, her voice full of fear. "He might try to hurt you." "I have to go," Maggie replied firmly. "We need answers, and maybe he's willing to confess." The next morning, Maggie arrived at the park, her heart beating wildly. Sitting on a bench, she waited. When Richard appeared, he looked different, more worn, as if the weight of his actions was finally crushing him. "Maggie," he began, sitting next to her, "I made terrible mistakes, but I can't change the past." His eyes were filled with tears, and for the first time, she saw a glimpse of true remorse. "Then confess, Richard. Admit what you did," Maggie said, her voice breaking with emotion. "You destroyed my grandfather's life, but you can still do the right thing." Richard lowered his head, tears streaming down his face. I don't know if I can. I'm afraid of losing everything." "You've already lost," Maggie replied gently. "You've lost trust, family, dignity, but you can try to redeem yourself." The meeting ended with a tense promise. Richard didn't give any guarantees, but Maggie returned home with a glimmer of hope. She told Sarah and Oliver about the meeting, and together, they decided to keep the pressure on, with James initiating the legal proceedings. The days that followed were an emotional roller coaster. Richard seemed hesitant, sometimes showing willingness to cooperate, other times retreating to his defensive stance. Maggie, Sarah, and Oliver, along with James, kept up the pressure, determined not to let Richard escape justice. Finally, on a rainy morning, an envelope arrived at Maggie's house. It was from Richard. Inside was a handwritten letter, with a full confession of his actions and an apology. Maggie read it aloud to Oliver and Sarah, their voices choked with emotion. "I, Richard Thompson, confess to forging documents and framing my brother, Jonathan. I accept all legal and familial consequences for my actions. I ask for forgiveness, although I know it doesn't erase the pain I've caused." Oliver cried, not from sadness, but from relief. After decades of suffering, the truth was finally coming to light. The journey was not yet complete, but the hardest step had been taken. As the rain beat against the windows, the sense of justice and hope began to fill the house. Richard's letter was a crucial step, but it was far from bringing the complete closure everyone hoped for. The truth was exposed, but the deep wounds still needed healing. Oliver, Sarah, and Maggie knew the next step was to bring Richard to justice, ensuring he faced the consequences of his actions. But also, somehow, they needed to find a path to inner peace. The legal process began swiftly. James, the lawyer, presented Richard's confession along with the gathered evidence, and the case gained attention in the local media. The community was shocked to learn of the betrayal within such a respectable family, and support for Oliver grew. However, the judicial battle would be long and emotionally draining. During the weeks that followed, Oliver, Maggie, and Sarah were called to testify. Each visit to the courtroom was an emotional torture, reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. Oliver, sitting in the witness chair, his voice trembling but firm, recounted the pain of years of abandonment and injustice. Every word was like reliving his worst nightmare, but also a step toward liberation. "I was betrayed by my own brother," Oliver said, his voice full of sadness and dignity. "I spent decades on the streets, alone, believing my family had abandoned me. But the truth is, I was the victim of a cruel scheme. I only want justice, not just for myself, but for all those who believed in me and supported me." Maggie and Sarah watched with tight hearts, holding each other's hands for strength. Seeing Oliver relive his pain was almost unbearable, but they knew it was necessary. After the testimony, Maggie found her grandfather in the courthouse hallways, enveloped him in a tight hug, and whispered, "We're almost there, Grandpa. We're almost there." During this time, Richard remained silent, his face a mask of remorse and despair. The written confession was undeniable, but he still needed to face justice formally. When it was time for his own testimony, the courtroom was charged with tension. "I made terrible mistakes," Richard began, his voice weak. "I destroyed my brother's life out of greed. There are no excuses for what I did. I'm prepared to face the consequences." The courtroom fell silent, absorbing the words that, though late, carried significant weight. Oliver looked at his brother with a mix of sadness and relief. Seeing Richard acknowledge his mistakes in public was an important step, but the damage was already done. Days later, the verdict was finally announced. Richard was convicted of document forgery and fraud, receiving a sentence that reflected the severity of his crimes. There was a sense of justice in the air, but also a deep sadness for the time and lives destroyed by his actions. With the case closed, everyone's attention turned to healing and rebuilding. Oliver, now legally exonerated and reintegrated into the family, began to find a new purpose. The community, moved by his story, came together to offer support. Events were organized to raise funds and help Oliver rebuild his life. Maggie and Sarah were by his side every step of the way, offering unconditional love and support. One calm night, sitting together in the garden under the stars, Oliver, Maggie, and Sarah reflected on all they had been through. "I never thought I would see this day," Oliver said, looking at the sky. "You gave me a second chance. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank us, Grandpa," Maggie replied, holding his hand. "We're family. We're in this together." Sarah nodded, silent tears running down her face. "We'll move forward, but we'll never forget what we've been through. And together, we can find peace." As the gentle wind rustled the leaves around them, a sense of serenity began to settle. The scars were deep, but now there was a real opportunity for healing. The road ahead would be challenging, but with love and mutual support, they were ready to face anything. Oliver's journey, marked by betrayal and suffering, now moved toward redemption and peace. The days following Richard's trial brought a tenuous calm, but not without challenges. Oliver, Maggie, and Sarah focused on the difficult task of rebuilding their lives and healing the deep wounds left by the past. Although Richard was now paying for his crimes, the pain and distrust lingered like ghosts that refused to disappear. Oliver still battled his internal demons. Decades of abandonment and betrayal had left deep scars on his soul. Every corner of the city seemed to carry painful memories of his cold nights on the streets, indifferent looks, and closed doors. Maggie, seeing the suffering in every tired gesture of her grandfather, decided she needed to do something more to help him find the peace he so deserved. One afternoon, while walking through the park where they had their first sincere conversation with Richard, Maggie held Oliver's hand and led him to a bench under a large tree. "Grandpa, I've been thinking a lot," she began, looking at him with eyes full of determination. "You've always been alone, always fought alone. But now you have me and Mom. We want you to know you'll never have to face anything alone again." Oliver squeezed Maggie's hand, his eyes glistening with tears. "I know, dear, but it's hard to erase everything I've lived. The pain, the humiliation. Those things don't disappear easily." "They don't disappear," Maggie agreed. "But we can create new memories. We can build something beautiful together. I was thinking, what if you wrote a book about your life? About everything you've been through and how you managed to overcome it?" Oliver looked at Maggie, surprised. "A book? I never thought of that. Who would want to read the story of an old homeless man?" "Many people," Maggie replied with an encouraging smile. "Your story isn't just about suffering. It's about resilience, hope, and the ability to forgive. It's a story that can inspire many to never give up, no matter how hard life gets." Maggie's words planted a seed in Oliver's heart. That night, he began to write. The words flowed like a torrent, each line loaded with raw emotion and unspoken truth. It was painful to relive many of the moments, but it was also a way to exorcise the demons that haunted him. While Oliver dedicated himself to writing, Maggie and Sarah worked tirelessly to support him. They organized community events, shared his story, and gathered support for the book's publication. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People from all over the city came together to support Oliver, offering their services and financial contributions. One morning, while reviewing one of the book's chapters, Oliver found an old photo he had kept all these years. It was a photo of him, Sarah, and young Maggie, taken before all the tragedy. He looked at the photo with tears in his eyes, remembering the happy days and the moments lost. Sarah entered the room and found Oliver looking at the photo. She approached, and upon seeing what he was holding, she also became emotional. "I remember that day," she said softly. "We were so happy." Oliver nodded, his voice choked with emotion. "I want us to be like that again. I want us to find happiness again, despite everything." "And we will," said Sarah, hugging her father, "because we're together now, and nothing will separate us again." Oliver's book, titled Under the Light of Forgiveness, was finally published and became an instant success. His life story touched many hearts, bringing not only recognition but also a renewed sense of purpose. Oliver began giving talks at schools and community events, sharing his journey and inspiring others never to give up. One afternoon, after an especially emotional lecture, Oliver was in the garden with Maggie and Sarah. The sun was setting, painting the sky with golden and pink hues. "I never thought I'd get here," Oliver said, watching the horizon. "From an old homeless man to an author. But here I am, thanks to you too." Maggie and Sarah approached, each holding one of Oliver's hands. "We're here for you, Grandpa," said Maggie, smiling. "And we always will be." Oliver's routine had changed drastically since the publication of his book. The success brought recognition and also a sense of justice he had never experienced. But the path to complete healing was still being walked. Each day was an emotional battle, with the past often coming back to haunt him. One gray morning, Oliver woke from a nightmare that transported him back to the streets, to the cold and loneliness. He got up slowly, feeling the weight of the memory, and went to the kitchen where Sarah was making coffee. Seeing him, she immediately noticed something was wrong. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked, concerned. Oliver tried to smile, but the pain in his eyes was evident. "Just a bad dream, dear. Nothing to worry about." Maggie entered the kitchen, noticing the tension in the air. "What happened?" she asked, looking from one to the other. Oliver hesitated, not wanting to worry his family further. "Sometimes it's hard to leave the past behind. These dreams seem so real." Maggie approached and held his hand. "Grandpa, we're here for you. Whatever you need, we'll face it together." Sarah nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "You're not alone, Dad. We'll get through this together." That afternoon, while walking through the neighborhood, Oliver began to talk about his time on the streets, something he rarely did. He described the cold nights, the indifferent looks, and the constant pain of being invisible to the world. "I felt like I didn't exist," he said, his voice laden with emotion, "like my worth was less than a stone on the sidewalk." Maggie and Sarah listened intently, feeling each word like a stab in their hearts. They desperately wanted to ease his pain, but they knew the only way was to let him vent and process his feelings. As they walked, they found a small square where children played and laughter echoed in the air. Oliver stopped, watching the children with a sad smile. "It's good to see the joy of these children," he said softly. "I remember when you were little, Maggie. Your laughter filled the house with life." Maggie squeezed his hand. "We can still have that, Grandpa. We can still find joy and create new memories." Sarah, feeling the emotion of the moment, hugged them both. "Let's build a new future together. A future where you never feel invisible again." Days later, Oliver received an unexpected invitation to speak at a conference on overcoming adversity and resilience. The invitation brought mixed emotions. The opportunity to inspire others was incredible, but the idea of revisiting his past in public was daunting. "You should do it, Grandpa," encouraged Maggie. "Your story can help so many people, and we'll be there with you." With his family's unwavering support, Oliver accepted the invitation. On the day of the conference, the auditorium was full. The lights shone brightly, and Oliver felt a wave of nervousness. But looking at the audience, he saw Maggie and Sarah in the front row, smiling and waving at him. That sight brought an unexpected calm. Stepping onto the stage, Oliver began to tell his story. Each word was a piece of his soul, exposed for everyone to see. He spoke of betrayals, cold nights on the streets, but also of unexpected kindness he found in strangers, and most importantly, of the unwavering love of his family that brought him back to life. "It's not easy to talk about what I've been through," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "But if my story can inspire one person not to give up, then it's worth it. I'm here today because of love and resilience, and we all have that within us." The silence in the auditorium was absolute, each person absorbing the depth of Oliver's words. When he finished, a wave of applause filled the space. Oliver, with tears in his eyes, thanked and stepped off the stage, feeling a relief he had never felt before. Maggie and Sarah ran to hug him, their eyes also filled with tears. "You were amazing, Grandpa," said Maggie, holding him tightly. "I'm so proud of you." Sarah smiled through her tears. "Dad, you touched everyone's hearts here. You're an inspiration." In the days that followed, Oliver received numerous messages from people who had been touched by his story. He began to realize that his pain had not been in vain. Every suffering, every battle faced, now served as a light to guide others in their own struggles. And so, with the unwavering support of his family, Oliver continued to walk toward healing. After the conference, Oliver's life changed even more. He became a respected and admired figure in the community, but most importantly, he found renewed purpose in sharing his story and helping others facing adversity. The pain still existed, but now it was transformed into strength and inspiration. One calm afternoon, Maggie received an unexpected call from a renowned publisher. The editor, moved by Oliver's story, wanted to publish an expanded edition of the book, including testimonials from people who had been impacted by the narrative of resilience. Maggie, excited, shared the news with Oliver and Sarah. "They want to publish a special edition of your book, Grandpa," she said, holding his hand, "with stories of people who were inspired by you." Oliver, surprised and touched, nodded with eyes full of tears. "I never thought my life could touch so many others. This is more than I ever imagined." The process of collecting testimonials and stories began. Maggie and Sarah dedicated themselves to finding people who wanted to share how Oliver's story had changed their lives. Each account was a new emotion, a new piece of hope added to Oliver's journey. Amid these activities, Oliver received a letter that deeply moved him. It was from a man named Michael, who had been his childhood friend, but with whom he had lost contact over the years of hardship. Michael, upon learning of Oliver's story, wanted to reconnect and offer his support. "Dear Oliver," the letter began, "I heard about your story and everything you've been through. I remember the days when we were young and full of dreams. I never imagined your life would take such a turn. I want you to know I'm here for you, my old friend." Reading the letter, Oliver was overcome by a wave of memories. Michael had been an important part of his past, and knowing he was alive and willing to reconnect brought unexpected comfort. He decided he needed to see him. Maggie and Sarah accompanied Oliver to the small town where Michael now lived. The reunion was emotional and filled with nostalgia. The two men, now elderly, embraced, sharing tears and laughter as they reminisced about the old days. "I never thought I'd see you again," Michael said, his voice choked with emotion. "When I heard your story, I couldn't believe it. You were always the strongest of us, Oliver. And I could never have done it without my family's support," Oliver replied, looking at Maggie and Sarah with gratitude. "They are my strength." The days following the reunion were filled with long, emotional conversations. Oliver and Michael reminisced about their youth, reflecting on the choices that led them down such different paths. There was healing happening there, a reconciliation with the past that brought new peace to Oliver's heart. One night, while sitting around a campfire in Michael's backyard, Oliver spoke about the importance of forgiveness and acceptance. "We carry so much pain, so many regrets," he said, looking at the dancing flames. "But it's possible to find peace. It's possible to move forward, no matter what happens." Maggie, sitting next to her grandfather, felt a lump in her throat. Seeing him so strong and vulnerable at the same time was a constant inspiration. "Grandpa, you've taught us so much, and you continue to teach everyone who hears your story." Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with tears. "We're so proud of you, Dad, and so grateful to have you back." The time with Michael was a balm for Oliver's soul. As they said their goodbyes, he promised to stay in touch and continue rebuilding the friendship that had been interrupted by time and adversity. Back home, Oliver felt a serenity he had never experienced. He was surrounded by love and support, and now, with the special edition of the book underway, he felt his life's mission was being fulfilled in ways he had never imagined. On a sunny afternoon, while resting in the garden, Oliver held Maggie's hand and looked at Sarah. "I'm lucky to have you. My life took a turn I never expected, but now I see everything happened for a reason. I'm finally at peace." Maggie and Sarah, with tears in their eyes, squeezed Oliver's hands, feeling the depth of the love and gratitude that united them. At the end of summer, the house of Oliver, Maggie, and Sarah was full of life. The walls, which once seemed to hold only shadows of the past, now echoed with laughter and conversations. The special edition of Oliver's book was about to be released, and the community was preparing to celebrate the event with a big garden party. On the morning of the launch, Maggie helped Oliver get dressed. He wore a suit that looked brand new but was actually the same one he had worn at his wedding decades ago. With eyes shining with emotion, Maggie adjusted his tie and smiled. "You look incredible, Grandpa. Today is your day." Oliver held Maggie's hand, love and pride reflected in his eyes. "None of this would be possible without you and your mother. You are my reason for living." The garden was decorated with twinkling lights and colorful flowers. Friends, family, and community members began to arrive, all eager to celebrate Oliver's story of overcoming. Sarah was busy organizing everything, but always with a watchful eye on her father, ensuring he was okay. When night fell, the lights came on, creating a magical atmosphere. Oliver stepped onto the small stage set up in the garden, with Maggie and Sarah by his side. He looked at the crowd, feeling the warmth of the support and love that surrounded him. "Today is not just about the launch of a book," he began, his voice full of emotion. "It's about a journey of pain, struggle, but also resilience and love. Each of you here has played a part in my story, and I am eternally grateful." The crowd applauded, some with tears in their eyes. Oliver continued, sharing anecdotes and reflections, each word loaded with meaning and feeling. When he finished, the applause was deafening. Maggie and Sarah hugged him tightly, feeling the weight of the moment. After the speeches, the party continued with music and dancing. Oliver, feeling lighter than ever, danced with Maggie and Sarah, laughing and enjoying every moment. The night was perfect, full of joy and hope. Suddenly, in the middle of the celebration, a man approached Oliver. It was Richard, his face marked by remorse and suffering. His presence made Oliver's heart tighten, but also brought a sense of closure. "Oliver," Richard began, his voice trembling, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I wanted to be here to apologize once more. Seeing you find happiness gives me hope that one day I can be forgiven." Oliver looked at Richard, a storm of emotions crossing his face. "Richard, the path to forgiveness is long and difficult, but I'm learning to leave the past behind. Today is a new beginning for all of us." Richard nodded, tears in his eyes. "Thank you, Oliver. It means more than I can express." As Richard walked away, Maggie and Sarah approached Oliver. "Are you okay, Grandpa?" Maggie asked, concerned. Oliver smiled, feeling a deep peace. "Yes, I am. Today, I am finally at peace." The party continued, and Oliver, Maggie, and Sarah stayed together, surrounded by friends and family. The pain of the past was slowly dissipating, replaced by love and hope. The future was uncertain, but they were ready to face it together, knowing that the most important thing was the strength of their unity. As the lights twinkled in the garden and the music played, Oliver looked at the starry sky, feeling a profound gratitude. He knew that despite all the adversities, he had found something precious: redemption and the love of his family. And so, under the mantle of the stars, Oliver's story, marked by pain and overcoming, found its peaceful and expected ending.